Thank you very much. Great to be here. I'm going to start, as I always do, by collecting some data. Hi, everybody. Why don't you wave? Now, that's great. I've collected that data on the extraordinary data collection devices which we all carry with us, which have made huge impacts on our lives. I should now ask you, does anybody have an objection if I share that data? We seem to be okay. Anyway, huge honor to be here. I've got to confess, I'm suffering a severe case of imposter syndrome looking out here and having heard that fantastic presentation, which has already stolen one of my points. So I'm very aware that I've got an audience absolutely immersed in the complex issues surrounding health data, an issue where I am just an interested amateur rather than an expert. But I do have some very strong interest in this issue, both from sorry, I always set a timer in case I bang on for too long. Another useful thing with these devices, if I go on for more than about 22 minutes, this will start pinging. Okay, I've got very strong interest in this issue because I come at it from a personal as well as a professional point of view, because I firmly believe that when it comes to health data, it's good to share. And that over the last 2 decades, we've sometimes got the balance wrong between absolutely relevant and important privacy concerns, but on the other side, the benefits to be reaped from sharing. Partly that views come from frustration about my own experiences as someone with 2 serious health conditions. Because when it comes to my health, I'm a manic sharer, perhaps an oversharer. So here's an example. Something from my own data collection, actually generated by a smartphone again, incredibly important devices. The smartphone era, by the way, began in 2007. I was there when Steve Jobs unveiled the iPhone in San Francisco and stuck my neck out and said, it was going to be a huge deal. There were complaints about my report on that on the 10 o'clock news that night, and I went on to defend myself, stuck my neck out and said, would the BBC have covered the arrival of the Model T Ford if it had been around at the same time? And I thought we would have. People were complaining that we were plugging a product. And I ventured maybe the iPhone and the smartphone, which it signals its arrival, would be as important, and it turned out to be more important. That's a bit of a diversion. Anyway, that picture dates quite a long time after my diagnosis in late 2004 with a malignant melanoma behind my left eye. I was diagnosed actually, or it was originally spotted in any case, by a high street optometrist, to whom I still go, who then sent me along to Moorfields Hospital, where I was told that I had this cancer behind the eye. Very scary diagnosis. After that, I had brilliant care over the years, and I'm still enjoying their care. I still visit Moorfields every few months, and have had various forms of radiotherapy, laser therapy, and even proton beam therapy 2 or 3 years ago. And that's all been brilliant, but world-class medicine hasn't been accompanied by world-class IT across the health service, or certainly world-class data sharing. I always say my early experience of going to Moorfields was sitting in a cramped, windowless basement with dozens of people and a whiteboard saying, 45 patients today, average wait 4 hours. Great volumes of paper being carried around in the form of the huge files on each patient. But once you've gone through all that process and all through the rigmarole, you got to see the world's leading expert in your field, which was kind of comforting. You just slightly wish that they had better technology. And the problem with the fact that everything was on paper was that it was not very shareable, and certainly not with me. And this came home to me a few years later. This is something around, actually probably about 2014. I kept going to see my optometrist because I owed them a debt, I felt. They're really good, they're quite expensive, but I go there every year. And one time they spotted another problem, a kind of layer over my eye. Not a hugely serious problem, but something which nevertheless they said was worth passing on. But there was a problem. The optometrist said she wanted my GP and my consultant to know about this, but she told me the rules did not allow her to share this image. She could, wait for it, fax it in black and white, but that was about it, which would not be very useful. So she encouraged me to take my iPhone, take a picture of it, including a bit of video, and take it along to the consultant the next time, which I did. And it turned out not to be that serious, but it was a kind of gobsmacking sort of light bulb goes on moment about telling me that there was a problem here. Optometrists tell me that has been largely dealt with now, but it, like everything in the NHS to do with IT and possibly data sharing, it's been slow in being sorted out. And things got more complex when I got a new diagnosis in 2019. I'd been, the previous summer, in 2018, I'd been on holiday with my wife, and I had been dragging my foot, and she, being slightly impatient, said, "Pick your feet up, pick your feet up." And I saw a physiotherapist who I see regularly for running injuries, I don't do any of that anymore. And he was a great guy, and he referred me to my GP, and 4 months later, as these things go, 4 months after the GP appointment, I got to see a neurologist, and it was confirmed that I had Parkinson's. And I kept it secret at first, but it became, you can probably see it now, it became a bit obvious on air when I was doing some various reports, and people wrote into the BBC and said, "What's that about?" So I decided to share that news, that piece of confidential data, as it were, with the world in the form of a tweet. And actually, I sent that tweet from about 2 miles away on a train to Birmingham, where I'd come to film on the day that 5G, it was a great technology landmark day. It was the day that 5G was launched in the UK, and we'd marked the occasion by doing a live broadcast from Covent Garden over the first 5G network run by EE. One irony, just before we went on air, I was live to the breakfast studio in Salford, and then cursed because the line went down. I said, "What's happening?" in not very suitable language. And it turned out that they'd been testing the Huawei router, Huawei, not allowed anymore, that was going to send the signal the day before. And they'd been driving around London with the EE team, and they'd used up all of the data. So the very embarrassed EE PR man had to top up the data, and then we could go live. But it was in that broadcast that my hand was very obviously shaking, which it only does really at moments of stress. So I'm pretty stressed by you lot. Anyway, so this is a great example of oversharing, but had a really good effect in that lots of people expressed sympathy, thousands of people expressed sympathy, I felt very supported. There was one person who said, you've been standing too close to 5G towers. That's what's caused your Parkinson's. But, you know, those people are out there. But interestingly, while I was sharing, so I now had two long-term conditions. The ocular melanoma, which was still active. In fact, it was about that time, that summer, that I had proton beam therapy for it. And now Parkinson's. While I was sharing that information, my doctors weren't, because that's not what the NHS appears set up to do. There were my GP, which I've been with for 30 years, has files. Moorfield has files. I think it was St Mary's Paddington at that time, which was treating me, had files on my Parkinson's, but nobody was joining the dots. So it was up to me to find out via Dr. Google that Parkinson's and ocular melanoma could be linked. Result of a little Google search popped up that finding. And it was me who had to tell my consultants at Moorfields and at St Mary's Paddington that there was this link, in case they were interested. I mean, it turned out that it's still unclear what the link is, and I'm not quite sure what we do with that piece of information anyway, but I've flung myself very much into any research around Parkinson's that I can get involved in, so I felt they ought to know. By the way, I'm wearing two watches, collecting vast amounts of data on myself. The Apple Watch, which is an expensive, not always useful device, which needs charging every night, and this, which has been supplied to me by the Royal Devon and Exeter Hospital for a medical trial I'm on, which is measuring my sleep patterns. This one has got a battery which lasts 60 days, so is vastly superior to the Apple Watch, although rather less attractive. So I had these two conditions, and I'd seen how frustrating it could be that data was not being shared effectively even between my different doctors, or possibly necessarily with me very much. But it hadn't until then been a subject for me as a journalist, as the technology correspondent of the BBC, to get much involved in. But that began to change during the pandemic, where I, like everybody, retreated to my loft and carried on working reasonably effectively, putting together a weekly radio program for the World Service from my loft with my producer in his kitchen in St Albans and another colleague in her kitchen in Maidenhead, and it all kind of worked well. And very early on, in late March 2020, I took a call from a very senior person in the tech community who told me that there was this very big effort going on to develop a contact tracing app. And this person seemed to think that I might want to become involved in this. And I gently suggested that I was a journalist and could not really get involved in that kind of effort, even if I had anything useful to contribute, which I was not sure I did. But I was very interested in knowing a lot about it. And I was then put in touch with somebody very senior who turned out to be a really good source and did a lot of journalism about what became the NHS COVID-19 app, which was a fascinating story, and very early on quickly developed into a story about data privacy, because there was a big debate about what form that app should take, with two options. One, a centralized option where data would be collected, anonymized data, but nevertheless quite sensitive data, I suppose. And don't forget, it wasn't data about who had been in contact with who else. It was data about which phone had been next to another phone for more than 10 minutes. And that data, under the original plan, was going to be collected on a sort of central server. And some of the scientists behind the development of the app, and they had lots of brilliant people working on this extraordinary effort. Real cutting-edge technology, don't forget, because nobody had tried using Bluetooth before to do this, and there was a lot of skepticism about whether it would work. A lot of, particularly the epidemiologists, thought that they would get more useful data about the spread of the virus if they had a centralized option. But there was probably a more influential lobby saying, no, that we've got to have a decentralized app which will see all the data collected staying on the phones, basically. And the phones, yes, talking to a server which will have the list of phone IDs which have identified themselves as positive for COVID to see if they've been in touch with them. But that will be the limit of the sort of centralized collection. So the decentralized group proved very influential, particularly because actually the centralized model didn't work very well. And why did it not work very well? Because the two technology giants who had developed a platform for contact tracing, Apple and Google, iOS and Android, didn't really allow the centralized version to work. Some really brilliant people working on the UK version managed to make it work better than people thought, but it was still pretty shonky. And so eventually the UK went down the decentralized route. And I mean, the untold story of the Nhs App is that actually it worked eventually pretty well. It became hugely unpopular because it worked so well. If you remember the pingdemic, when people were being sent home, there was a lot of fury with the app, which, don't forget, was anonymous, so therefore, you couldn't be found out if you had disobeyed it anyway. But there was a paper in Science which seemed to show that it had been effective and had cut the spread of the virus and had cut deaths quite substantially. But in thinking about this, I for quite a while was concerned that too much stress had been placed on the privacy arguments, on what seemed to me to be a fairly imaginative description of what could go wrong with a centralized app, of how the information could be de-anonymized and a malicious government could indulge in mass surveillance, versus the alternative, which was that if we didn't go ahead with this app, we could all be locked down for longer. So at that stage, various countries, notably South Korea, were indulging in actually much more evident forms of surveillance and coercion, turning up at people's homes if their batteries ran out on their phones, which they'd registered as identifying themselves for quarantine purposes. So I felt the debate was slightly skewed, although in the end, the decentralized app did work pretty well, and the epidemiologists managed to get more data out of it than they had imagined. So perhaps it was all a fuss over nothing. But I thought the other big interesting question was why we had decided that Google and Apple were good adjudicators of what was good for us in terms of health policy and better than governments, which seemed an interesting point of view. So that made me think about this, and I decided I wanted to explore the data sharing issue further. So when news emerged last year of a plan for GPs to pool data which would be used for research by academics, doctors, and horror of horrors, businesses, I wanted to know more. And as Janet showed, some of those I think this is one of the worst headlines. NHS data grab on hold as millions opt out. The headline basically could have been written by one side of the argument, the privacy campaigners. It is not a national effort to share data for the benefit of all. It's a data grab. And they've managed to persuade millions of people to opt out of the scheme by posting a kind of a horrifying picture of insurance companies, tech giants having unlimited access to your data. So again, I thought, well, this is really interesting. The whole debate seems to be framed from one angle. We're not hearing much about the benefits of the scheme. And all the coverage of that scheme, which is still on hold as far as I understand, I suppose refers back to the great care.data fiasco of a decade ago. And I kind of knew a bit about that. I sort of lodged somewhere in my brain. I'd never covered it. That was the health correspondence patch. But I thought, what did go wrong with that? Why had it been such a disaster? Had it ended up with millions of health records being sold to an insurer or something like that? So I did a bit of Googling, and this is the first article that came up from actually one of my colleagues, I think, back in, I think 2014 is sort of an inquest piece. But interestingly, the whole scheme is not so much, the whole article is not so much about the scheme itself, but about just how poorly the NHS had sold it to the public. A video animation was produced, but it went only on YouTube and NHS England's website. There was no national TV campaign, nor was a press conference called to launch the marketing campaign. So I was left by this article, anyway, unclear what went wrong, whether this was just a marketing disaster, or whether there were any genuine privacy minefields in the scheme which should have seen it canned as it eventually was. It was pretty obvious to me that the scheme had been handled in a cat-handed way, but there'd been no real debate, as far as I can see, about how necessary it might be to have such a scheme. Although, of course, part of the problem in the coverage of that was we had got used to repeated disastrous IT schemes where giant multi-billion-pound contracts had been given to giant unresponsive tech companies who, didn't deliver for the public. So I think the scheme obviously suffered from that. In the last 6 months since I've left the BBC, I've started a newsletter about health and technology, sort of broad subject. And again, I'm an amateur in this, wandering around trying to find stuff. I'll only go on for another few minutes. But I got a flavour of the damage caused by data paralysis in the NHS writing this article, which is about a programme to create something which I was amazed to find didn't exist, a registry of all the medical devices put inside people. And this effort came out of the report into the vaginal mesh scandal, where thousands, tens of thousands of women were damaged by that product being put into people, and they discovered that there was no central database listing those women. Local NHS trusts had databases, but they were terrified, it seems for good reason, of sharing their data with others because that required a change in the law in some cases. So talking to the great people from, I think I always get confused between NHS X and NHS Digital, but one or the other, I was impressed by what they were trying to do and how simple it was. They were trying to bring simple technology into the NHS, basically putting a barcode on all of these devices and giving staff a scanner to scan it and link it to a patient. As they put it, technology which has been used by supermarket workers for more than 20 years, but was still seen as radical inside some hospitals. So that was a bit of another picture of how difficult it has been to share data which has incredible importance and value to patients as well as clinicians. Let's end on a positive note. Things are getting better. Just my experience of interactions with the health service, particularly over the last couple of years, text messages, a big advance on interaction with the health service and reminder of one's appointments for a forgetful person like me. Something called Patients Know Best, which is kind of clunky, but a bit of an advance. I found scan results last week, which I didn't know were there, which enabled a better conversation with my GP when the GP eventually rang 3 weeks after the scan to tell me the results. Though it was still me who then had to share that result with the consultant who'd actually ordered the scan in the first place. So a lesson that you still have to be quite a savvy patient to make the system work properly. And finally, I'm still trying to get my head around it, but Ben Goldacre's report seems to be a really good and coherent piece of work on trusted research environments, which seems to take on board most of the privacy concerns while proposing a practical solution. And one can only hope that what you might call the privacy ultras will collaborate with that. So what I'm hoping for is a more balanced debate on this whole issue, and I'm really excited to be here today and to learn more about this. This is, for me, a great learning opportunity. But what I would say to you is it's good to share. So thank you very much.
Going live? Yep, there we go. Excellent.
1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Oh, yes, I think that works.
Excellent. Rory, thank you.
How many audio engineers does it take to change a light bulb?
I don't know. How many does it take?
1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay.
Excellent.
The old ones are always the best.
I think we've got some roving mics that will be available for people to ask questions. So if you just have a moment to consider, I'm going to use Chair's prerogative to sort of ask the first one, Rory, if that's all right. You mentioned, I think, as you went through your sort of speech presentation and talked to us around, I guess, supermarkets, Model T, big tech, and I guess as technology correspondent, you had that sort of privilege to look across a whole range of industries. I suppose I'm interested from a health data and health data research perspective. Which are the sort of industries or areas that you'd perhaps look at to say, actually, there's more that that the health service or particularly health data research we can learn from?
I wouldn't necessarily lecture people on learning from Apple or Google or whatever. I think there's a danger in doing it. There's a great example here. I don't know if people have heard about Theranos, the extraordinary blood test startup in California whose owner was convicted of fraud. There's a great, I think is it Netflix? Anyway, there's a great drama about it. One of the top Silicon Valley venture capitalists was a huge defender of Elizabeth Holmes, the founder of Theranos, and said basically, he repeated the Silicon Valley mantra of, you've got to fail fast and move on. And he said that's all she was doing, seemingly completely blind to the fact that it's all very well when you're launching a game or a dating app, but when it comes to people's health, you can't go down that same route. So I would be cautious about telling the health and the health data industry that you've got to be like Silicon Valley, or you've got to be like another industry. You have got to try and spread the technology a bit faster. but you do have different constituencies to satisfy along the way. All I'm saying is that seems to have been, over the last 20 years, one constituency that has been pleased more than others, which is the constituency that wants to stop any sharing.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. From the audience, who would like to pose the first question? I think the hand went up the quickest over there, so I think we haven't got any table numbers on. Gentleman in the white shirt on.
One, two, one, two.
I think it should.
I suppose what I mean is there seems to be a lobby, and I may be, this may be a pastiche extreme view. There seems to be a lobby that feels that anonymization is impossible, which may well be true. That any data sharing with a technology company or a pharmaceutical company is to be resisted at all costs. I mean, the first instinct of a lot of people confronted with any new data sharing scheme seems to be, and I was a journalist who looked for those stories too, looked for those dangers. The first instinct seems to be, will this lead to an Orwellian state? And all I'm saying is that I would like some of those people to also suggest routes forward which would lead to better outcomes. I think we had that interesting slide from Janet, which showed that some of the paths would lead to sort of 90% of studies being ineffective, and that's my concern.
Thanks, Rory. So very much about the sort of the willingness to try and work to a solution as opposed to having a sort of solid line that people can't move beyond.
Yeah, I'm interested in hearing from you. I mean, as I said at the start, I am a complete novice to this area. You know the complexities of it, so I'd be interested in your views on whether we've got the balance wrong or not.
Thanks. Okay, so views or questions? John next, then we'll come to somebody over this side of the room.
Yeah, it's a question rather than a reaction to that, if I may, Rory. Picking up on it's good to share, could you comment on what your position is on the public perception of that now, post-COVID, compared with how it was before the pandemic? Have you seen a shift, and would you think that shift is permanent if there has been a shift?
Well, I think a lot of this comes back to, we were talking earlier to one of your colleagues about the term big pharma, and what we think about the pharmaceutical industry. And I was positing a question in an opinion poll, and making the point is it's very much how you frame it. If you ask people, would you be willing to share your health data with companies that might use it to make profits? You can bet your life that you get a large majority saying no. If you framed it as, would you be willing to share your data in an effort to find a life-saving vaccine, you might get a different result. And I think what has happened during the pandemic is that there has been a shift towards an understanding of that latter view of the world, which may not be permanent, but is quite encouraging. I've written quite a lot about disinformation during the pandemic, and what's interesting is there has been a huge amount of disinformation spread by, smartphones, spread by social media and so on. But the encouraging thing is maybe it hasn't been as effective as we feared. If you remember, before the vaccine arrived, or when it was about to arrive, there were various estimates of what take-up would be, and 60, 70% or so on. And nearly all the estimates turned out to be way short of how enthusiastic the British public was to accept the vaccine. So you get a bunch of nutters making a lot of noise, spreading a lot of disinformation. I think most of the general public has been educated during the pandemic about vital medicine, i.e. vaccines, and so there has been a bit of an improvement in public understanding.
Okay, thank you. I think Nigel next, and then...
Hello, this is Neil Walker. I'm Chief Data Officer of one of the hubs. So the question is, Ben Goldacre recommends having not very many places where data is collated. Do you have a view on what a fit and proper organisation would be that ran those places?
God,
and I'm thinking
that's what I've come here to learn.
I'm thinking Palantir is in the running, or was in the running.
Who was in the running?
Palantir.
Oh, Palantir was in the running. Well, Palantir is a really interesting... I feel very much split about Palantir. I don't think it should be in the running because, fairly or unfairly, it's missing out on the T in trusted research environment. Actually, having talked to Palantir, they seem to be doing really good work, but they were founded by Peter Thiel, who's got a very interesting reputation. There is, I think there's also a valid mistrust of the sheer power of the West Coast in technology, and I think, you know, if I come back to the T in TRE, it's very important that certainly at the early stage you get in companies that, or organisations that can command the trust of a large section of the public. Otherwise, you're failing before you get going. By the way, I did interview Peter Thiel once. He was rather charming. He came into the BBC to see me, and there's a TARDIS in the BBC cafe at Broadcasting House, and he turned out to be a Doctor Who fanatic. So I've got a lovely picture of the man who's now seen as Satan by some in technology, with a sweet grin standing in front of the TARDIS.
Excellent. I think gentleman down here.
Thank you. As a great communicator of tech and complicated messages to the general public, and some of the points that Janet mentioned in her opening talk, what is it that HDR UK, for example, has to learn about communicating what we do better so that, you know, we address the issues before they rear up and take us by surprise?
Well, getting in early is one very important thing. The first thing, and this is probably not your fault, but the first thing most people heard about the GP data collection, what's it called? It's called GPDRS, is it?
GP data for planning and research, yeah.
GPDPR. Very unfortunate to give it an acronym almost identical to GPDR. Getting in early, and it's not your fault, but every organization has its own language. I've already struggled with several acronyms. You all speak that language, I know. But it's really important to try and get some accessible language in right from the start so that people know what they're talking about. Because when the first thing they see is a headline in The Guardian about NHS data grab, the battle is lost by then, really. And I don't pretend it's easy, and I don't pretend that journalists are brilliant at understanding these things or putting a great picture across. But there are an increasing number of actually really good and honest scientific and health data journalists in the UK, and it's important to speak to them at an early stage, I'd say.
And through that, I mean, do you think that, I mean, is the sort of mainstream media still the main source? Do you think there was a sort of link between that and the opt-outs, or was it in many ways more through social media?
Well, don't forget that what people do forget a lot of the time with social media is that it is a huge source of people's acquisition of information, but a large amount of that information is sharing articles in the mainstream media. I mean, those kind of Guardian and Observer articles will have been shared tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands times, would have been forwarded on WhatsApp and so on. So the mainstream is still hugely important. It's a battle that can be won, but needs a lot of effort.
Thank you. One over this side, and then we'll go back over that side. Yep.
Hello, thank you very much for organizing this event, actually. I'm from a computing background, so I came from the IEEE Society for the UK and Ireland for computing. So we are actually in charge of the computing chapter. Lots of work we've been looking at is body sensor, AI, and data analytics. So I have two questions here. First of all is we are actually wearing a lot of sensors to watches and lots of other devices. So we had a project to do long-term monitoring for a patient, but obviously these kind of data are not really within the clinical domain. So my first question is, what is your view of integrating those wearable sensor data, personalized data, and sort of long-term monitoring data into the whole system? Obviously, I think the data in the clinical domain is already very, very complicated. So adding another dimension, is there a scope there? So that's my first question.
Well, shall I answer that first? I think this is a really exciting area, and it's an area I've been writing about a lot. As far as I understand, this is happening, but it involves quite a complicated process of getting these devices and the software on them regulated as medical devices by the MHRA. So that's quite a big barrier. And I'm kind of interested in the contrast between this device and that device. There's a whole division in the community that is developing these things between those developing bespoke devices, which is obviously in some ways, you know, should the healthcare community be developing smartwatches? Is a question mark. And those who are going with the Apple Watch. Actually, in some ways, it may be easier to get approval, MHRA approval for a bespoke device, which is obviously whose intent is obvious, rather than a device which does dozens of things and whose charge only lasts overnight. So I think there are lots of opportunities there and various hurdles in terms of regulatory approval. But the other thing to remember is the huge enthusiasm of consumers. People who've got these devices, people like me with long-term conditions, are desperate to use them in any way they can. For instance, I've got an app on my phone which pings every 4 hours to tell me to take my pills. That's a very simple thing. But every time I write about, an app that could be coming on the Apple Watch to monitor symptoms of Parkinson's, because Parkinson's is a really difficult thing to measure, and there's a huge amount of work going on in measuring that. I get huge enthusiasm from the Parkinson's community. So I think there will be sort of pressure, good pressure, coming from people like that to make use of these devices, to share their own data.
Okay, thank you. And I have a second question. I've been working with, so my background is data science and working with clinicians for a phase 3 clinical trial. And what we have found is we have some data collected from the UK, and we also have some data collected from the Indian patient cohort. And then we use AI tools to project those multidimensional data. We're looking at 4,000 sort of different kind of data for one particular patient, and then project that into a 2D space for visualization. Then interestingly, what we find is the patient data we collected in the UK tends to cluster together. And then we found another cluster represent the Indian data. And then this allows us to ask the question why that happens. So we end up actually digging out the Indian cohort patient data and find out there were several columns being inputted wrong. So they are all the same number as 2.333. And so ultimately, this is a tool to help us to identify something wrong with this patient record. So overall, I believe there is a scope for data science to collaborate with HDR. So I wonder, what's your view of sort of collaborating with the IEEE Society, Computing Society in the UK, all sort of data science domain? What's your plan in the future to integrate these two together? Because
I don't think this is a question for me. I'm the guest speaker. I'm not representing HTR.
Yeah, no, I suppose echo. I think it's really important that through health data science we do bring together all of those different disciplines. There's a number of computer scientists in the room today as well that hopefully we'll be able to sort of network with and join with and work out how best to do those collaborations. And say, important across all of it, I think the sort of area of wearables that you highlighted, I think it presents some particular challenges. So thank you.
Thank you.
I think there's at least one more question over here. A couple, yep.
Hi, my name is Lee. I'm the Chief Executive at a charity Action Against Age-Related Macular Degeneration. And we are the charity partner at Insight Hub. Very interesting, your experience with opticians. Yeah. So my question here to you, Rory, is we have all been looking to data which is collected when we know we have disease. Now, with the edge collecting of your devices, I was wondering what's your view about us perhaps convincing the general communities to adopt this mentality of collecting data earlier while we're still healthy, so we can start to unpick, perhaps detect early signs of different diseases, and therefore move the treatment prevention into earlier stages. What's your view on that?
I think that's a really interesting question, and obviously is the way one suspects the world is going. And I think there's great potential, but it's the same issue as is always there. What is going to be the level of trust in the public? I mean, we are, every Apple phone, every Android phone collects a vast amount of data which could certainly be used, for instance, in measuring people's gait and potentially spotting conditions like Parkinson's. So it's completely how it's marketed. What I failed to say during my talk was that I began to have concerns that I was going too far in the argument against privacy yesterday when I was reading about Roe v. Wade. And there's a huge debate, and somebody actually messaged me this morning saying, what about that? There are big concerns that data collected on women by all sorts of devices and apps and their phones generally could be used by people in the United States trying to criminalize abortion. Now that is obviously, because I always have thought that a lot of the scenarios were kind of dystopian, slightly fantastical scenarios of the dangers you could have from sharing data. But that is a real-world example, and actually plausible. So that does give me a certain pause for thought. And it's against that background that, I mean, what you're talking about is really exciting and imaginative, but it will succeed or fail against the general background of trust. And that argument is flowing back and forth in different directions and has just taken a bad hit from the Roe v. Wade issue in the States.
Yeah, indeed, a very sobering thought, I think, on that. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. I think, yep, at the back there.
Related to that, and it may apply to Parkinson's, but this is particularly my observation in Alzheimer's disease and that area, is there's a huge industry interest in pre-disorder diagnosis where we don't have an intervention at all, and it seems to be, you know, the potential for generating undue amounts of worry.
Yeah.
And situations where nothing can actually be done, compared to a huge need for better monitoring of the condition when people actually have it, where there are interventions that could be done, but there seems to be very little industry interest, and everyone's after the very large populations who might possibly develop dementia in 5 years' time, and detecting them early, but producing, you know, creating situations where there's no answer at all. And I guess, I don't know whether that's true in Parkinson's disease as well, but it's clearly a danger.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly in relation to Alzheimer's, that is a real concern. I think possibly with Parkinson's there is some hope now that a drug may be on the horizon which could at least halt the progress of the condition. Because up until now, there's been very little progress in that area at all. So if that does happen, then obviously halting it at a very early stage or before it had actually manifested itself would be a good thing. So I think there is a potential case there. I completely agree, having an elderly relative suffering from dementia, that knowing about you might be going to get it in 5 years' time may not be useful information. There's a lady there.
So I think this, unfortunately, we're going to have to make this the last question, even though there's still lots of hands going up in order to stay on time. So.
Hi, Jo Knight from Lancaster University. Not everybody has an Apple Watch, and indeed, if a homeless person goes into an accident emergency department, their NHS number is not always registered. So I was wondering if you'd given any thought to how to ensure inequalities aren't exacerbated when using kind of technologies and data.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a truism, isn't it, that that with each new wave of technology, if you choose to use it, you are going to get a distorted picture, because you will get a certain section of the population. But it seems to me that it's a slight counsel of despair to say, well, we won't use it because not everybody's got it. But at the same time, you've obviously got to be very careful in factoring that into your interpretation of the data that you do get, recognizing that there is a data hole in any study you're doing. But there doesn't seem to be any useful approach that says, well, we're not going to use it.
Okay, that's absolutely fantastic. So again, apologies for those who had their hands up and didn't manage to get a question asked, but I think that just shows the level of interest and engagement there is in this topic in general, which I think will obviously run through the day, and in particular with Rory's presentation and sort of articulation of the benefits, as well as a good understanding of the risks associated with sharing. So Rory, thank you very much indeed again.